Since 2011, the radical jihadist group, the Islamic State of Iraq and al-Sham, or ISIS, has been gaining ground in Iraq, Syria and beyond. But now, more moderate Islamists are striking back, and on the 8th of January, they took over a key ISIS stronghold in the Syrian city of Aleppo. I'm Layla Milana Allen, The Economist's Middle East and Africa multimedia producer, and joining me on the line from Cairo is Sarah Burke, our Middle East correspondent. Sarah, ISIS is an al-Qaeda affiliate, but can you tell me a bit more about their origins and how they've evolved since then?
Sure. So ISIS started as Al-Qaeda in Iraq back when the Americans were next door to Syria there. And they spread into Syria last year, around April. And at the time, no one quite knew if they'd survive or not. And they grew and grew and grew and expanded across the country, taking control of lots of the areas which had hitherto been under the control of the normal Syrian rebels. And ISIS is made up of a lot of foreign fighters. There are Syrians, there are Iraqis, but it's also drawn jihadists from across the globe.
So what exactly is it that they want, and how does that differ from the other more moderate groups?
Whilst their fighters are fighting against the regime, often alongside other groups, their main aim seems to be consolidating their own control of areas that are taken over by the rebels. So among the Syrian rebel groups, there are very different visions for Syria. Some would like an Islamist state, some would like a secular civilian democracy, but ISIS doesn't have a vision for Syria per se. It doesn't believe in national borders, and what it would prefer is an Islamist state that extended across the whole of the Levant.
So until recently, ISIS was doing well and expanding their power base, but now it looks like they're in trouble. What's gone wrong?
ISIS's tactics have been unpopular in Syria for a long time, mainly because they've been kidnapping aid workers, kidnapping journalists, imposing their vision over Syrian cities and towns that they take over, and also clashing with other rebel groups in order to expand their power base. And until recently, other groups had tried to accommodate them, thinking it was better that everyone was fighting against Assad rather than fighting among themselves. But a couple of things have triggered these clashes over the last few days, and now they've spread across the north and northeast of Syria. One of the concerns that Syrians have is that ISIS is giving the wrong impression of the rebels to the outside world. So whilst the Syrian rebels generally have grown out of the street protests that started in 2011, ISIS have really changed the nature of the rebels, making them seem much more extreme, and they're the only ones that lots of the international community now focus on. So one of the things you often hear from diplomats is that they're not willing to fund the opposition in case the materials, the money gets into ISIS's hands.
So how important is the success or failure of ISIS to how things develop across the region?
I mean, it's obviously important for several reasons. For the outside world, it's important for the security of how much of an operating base ISIS actually has inside Syria, which at the moment is quite expansive. For Syrians, it obviously matters for how their war continues. Now, some people are worried that too much rebel infighting will mean that there's not enough focus on the regime and the regime will grow stronger. But others obviously hope that if ISIS were to be defeated, there would be possibly more support to the opposition. Another thing that a defeat of ISIS would help is the growing wave of sectarianism that spread across the region between Sunni and Shia, mainly growing out of Syria's war and the sectarian rhetoric coming from ISIS and some other rebel groups as well.
And what do you predict is going to happen over the next few months?
It's very hard to predict. It does seem unlikely that ISIS will be able to just take over towns and cities as they have done so far without some sort of backlash against them. But it also doesn't look like ISIS are just sort of going to shrink away. They've done very well out of Syria's war and very well out of the worsening security situation in western Iraq. And so far they've been fighting back against the rebels. A couple of other groups have suggested ceasefires, working together, that some of ISIS's fighters join other Syrian rebel groups, but so far ISIS hasn't agreed to any of this. In fact, it's been carrying out car bombings against other rebels in the north in the last few days. So what happens in the next few weeks and months in Syria and also in Iraq, where the forces are posed to try and take back towns that have been captured by ISIS, will have an important impact on what happens in both countries in the near future.
That was Sarah Burke, our Middle East correspondent on the line from Cairo. In London, this is The Economist.
The Economist.